Greetings. This is Ekaterina Nesterenko in the studio with you. Today we're talking about this, powerful strikes on Russia's fuel arteries. The Novokuibyshevsk and Orenburg plants are on fire. Lines, chaos, and diluted gasoline. Putin is demanding the entire Donbas in exchange for so-called peace. Mass protests in the US, millions against Trump. In Paris, the Louvre was robbed in 7 minutes, and in Poland, not far from the border with Belarus, a secret tunnel was discovered. All this and more in just a few seconds. But right now, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel Ukraine Today so you don't get lost on YouTube. Well then, let's get started. Powerful blows to the Russian economy. Ukraine carried out a series of precision strikes on key fuel infrastructure sites in Moscow. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed the attack on the Novokuibyshevsk oil refinery in the Samara region. The primary oil processing units were damaged. The Orenburg gas processing plant lost a key gas processing and purification unit. And in occupied Berdyansk, the strike hit a fuel depot that supplied equipment to the occupiers. In Feodosia, 11 fuel tanks were destroyed during strikes on October 7th and 13th. They cannot be restored. This is part of Ukraine's strategy. From August to October 2025, 36 precise strikes were recorded, including repeated attacks on oil and gas processing plants in the Russian Federation. August marked the start of the campaign against Russian fuel. September saw strikes on deep processing facilities. In October, the strike radius expanded to the eastern wing of Russia's energy sector. Orenburg is located 1,200 kilometers from Ukraine, which demonstrates the growing range and high precision of the strikes. As we can see, Russia is systematically losing fuel. Refineries are burning, and the occupiers' logistics are facing serious difficulties. Ukraine continues to precisely target the enemy's critical infrastructure, rewriting the rules of the game. I never cease to admire the courage and heroism of Ukrainian soldiers. They hold the front and stand against a vast horde that greatly outnumbers them. That's why I urge you to support the armed forces of Ukraine, and if you can't do so financially, write them words of encouragement in the comments. I know they're watching us. Meanwhile, the gasoline crisis in Russia is growing larger and larger. Kilometer-long lines and rapidly rising prices. Here's a recent video from the city of Surgut, in the Tyumen region. Huge lines are forming at gas stations. Drivers wait for hours for the coveted gasoline. Residents complain that there's almost no fuel. Deliveries are coming in with interruptions. Local media point out a more mundane reason. Cars are lining up at gas stations where gasoline is 15 to 16 rubles cheaper per liter. However, the gasoline crisis can no longer be hidden. According to WebBanker, 74% of Russians have noticed an increase in gasoline prices. 90% expect further price hikes, and almost every fifth person is facing a complete lack of fuel. 40% of drivers are cutting back on trips, and a third are switching to cheaper fuel. The quality of gasoline is declining. According to the Union of Car Services, it has started being diluted with toxic additives to increase the octane rating. There are already reports of mass breakdowns of Chinese Geely cars. Engines are failing after just a few hundred kilometers. The gasoline crisis is felt especially acutely in Russian regions, and this is a direct consequence of the senseless war that the Kremlin is waging against Ukraine. A scandalous leak from the Washington Post. The reputable publication reports that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, during his last conversation with Donald Trump, demanded full control over the Donetsk region in exchange for the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions. According to the Washington Post, the Kremlin calls this a condition for ending the war. The American publication claims that Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, even pressured the Ukrainian side, stating that Donbas is a Russian-speaking region and therefore it should be with Russia. But this logic is an old Kremlin manipulation. There are people in Ukraine who do indeed speak Russian, but that does not mean they support Moscow at all. Meanwhile, Russian opposition figure Mikhail Khodorkovsky said in an interview with Sky News, Putin is sending Trump a signal that he is ready for a deal.
I got the impression that Putin sent Trump a signal that he is ready for a deal. Putin wants to get the whole of Donbas, including those parts he has not yet occupied.
According to him, the Kremlin may use any territorial concessions to destabilize the rest of Ukraine and undermine the West from within. Speaking about the issue of handing over Ukrainian land to the Russians, President Volodymyr Zelensky emphasized that Ukraine will not give anything to Russia as a gift.
We will not give the aggressor anything, and we will not forget anything. We can clearly see that this Russia is a long-term threat.
Reading the comments under previous episodes, I see that many of you are watching us from Kazakhstan, Moldova, Europe, and even the USA. We Ukrainians are very grateful for your support and proud to have such reasonable viewers. Let us know in the comments under this episode as well which country you are watching from and whether people there support our fight against the empire of evil. I always enjoy reading your comments. And now we continue. The most interesting part is coming up. The Russians are actively expanding their main airbase in Engels. They are pouring concrete there and preparing 12 new parking spots for strategic aviation. This is evidenced by satellite images obtained by Ukrainian intelligence. What is the enemy planning and how can the Ukrainian armed forces prevent it? Coming up in the story.
The Russian Federation is trying to revive its strategic aviation.
In October, Russia is significantly stepping up its ongoing efforts to expand its main strategic aviation base. This information comes from Avi Vector, a respected military observer.
New construction is being observed at the Engels 2 airbase. In the northern part, they are pouring concrete, building additional taxiways, and marking out 12 parking spaces.
The Engels 2 airbase is one of the main hubs of strategic aviation for the occupying country. It is from there that strategic bombers take off to launch cruise missiles at Ukrainian territory. In addition, a significant amount of missile and aviation weaponry is stored at this base.
These engineering works began back in the spring. The active phase of construction has been ongoing for the past few months. It is likely that this is where the strategic missile carriers Tu-95MS and Tu-160 will be stationed, as well as Su-34 frontline bombers and Su-35 fighters. And at first glance, it might seem like ordinary construction work, but for military experts, this is a worrying sign. The expansion of the airbase increases the operational capabilities of the enemy's aviation, reduces the time between sorties, raises the number of combat-ready aircraft, and simplifies the logistics of ammunition delivery.
These construction works at the Engels 2 airfield are, first and foremost, a demonstration. After the significant strike by Ukrainian drones on March 20th, 2023, very intensive construction efforts immediately began. In other words, the Russian Federation is clearly trying to demonstrate and show that this particular military facility is indeed a top priority for them. Moreover, it is protected by air defense systems. So this is more of a political signal for the domestic audience rather than for the external one, that is for Ukraine or the United States. In other words, it is an attempt to demonstrate that the Russian central government is in control of the situation.
At the same time, work is also being carried out at another airfield, Diaghilevo in the Ryazan region. The aggressor country is trying to restore the mobility of its air force and the density of its basing, reducing its dependence on individual runways. Additional parking spaces and taxiways make it possible to deploy aircraft more quickly, increase the number of takeoffs, and reduce the time equipment spends in vulnerable positions.
With such extensive construction work being undertaken at these various military facilities, the Russian Federation is clearly trying to demonstrate to the international community that it continues to view its so-called missile terror as a critically important and primary element of its military political pressure tactics on the leadership of Ukraine. In other words, lacking the ability to achieve real success on the front line, the main focus of the Russian occupation army is on strikes, including with the use of strategic aviation against infrastructure facilities on Ukrainian territory and residential cities.
But expanding the bases is only part of the equation. Aviation requires crews, fuel, munitions, and secure supply lines. Losses among personnel, logistical problems, and international restrictions on components reduce the effectiveness of the new sites. Simply put, having more parking spaces does not mean more strikes in the near future.
And considering that the airfield is located about 600 kilometers from the line of contact, 600 kilometers from the notional Russian-Ukrainian border, it is within range of Ukrainian strike drones and accordingly Ukrainian strike capabilities. We're talking about the long-range Neptune. Therefore, if there is indeed recorded activity of Russian aviation specifically from this airfield, there will be reciprocal responses from the Ukrainian side in the form of strikes against legitimate military targets. And this military airfield is a legitimate military target when it is used both for American strike systems in the event they are supplied and accordingly for the wide range of strike systems produced by Ukraine.
And these airfields have become favorites for the Ukrainian side. In particular, in March, the Ukrainian armed forces carried out one of the largest attacks on Engels 2. An ammunition depot was hit, and about 96 air-launched cruise missiles, intended for several rounds of attacks, were destroyed. Strikes on fuel reserves also seriously weakened the enemy's capabilities. And while the enemy tries to expand its infrastructure, Ukrainian defense is being modernized. If there is even the slightest activity threatening Ukrainian cities, our defenders will once again deliver precise and devastating strikes, depriving Russia of its last remaining aircraft.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Huge losses for Russia with minimal results at the front. In May 2025, Russia launched a large-scale offensive, attempting to break through Ukrainian positions. In the following months, attacks covered almost the entire front line, but the territorial gains were minimal, just 0.4% of Ukraine. At the same time, the cost in manpower turned out to be disproportionately high, notes The Economist. The journalists conducted their calculations based on satellite data and more than 200 assessments from Western governments and independent experts. Their conclusion is this: Putin is paying a huge price for minimal gains on the battlefield.
According to The Economist's meta-estimates, from the start of the full-scale invasion until January 2025, Russian troop losses amounted to between 640,000 and 877,000 people. As of October 13th, these losses had increased by almost 60%, reaching between 984,000 and 1,438,000 people.
Russia did not achieve its key objectives in the spring-summer offensive. Journalists note that Pokrovsk and other cities are holding their defenses steadfastly, despite relentless attacks. At the same time, Russian propagandists are complaining about meat grinder assaults, massive losses, and the lack of evacuation for the wounded.
We have a terrible problem. I'm judging by what people are writing. Evacuation and medical losses, that is, our wounded, for objective reasons, well, you can't get them out, are forced to wait for help, sometimes for days, yes, while wounded, and it's very, very difficult to evacuate them. And they say that now our medical losses are no longer 1 to 3. 1 killed for every 3 wounded, but almost 1 to 1 already.
The German publication Catapult has shown the scale of the occupation of Ukraine. The area controlled by Russia is comparable to almost 4 Belgiums or 1.5 Czechias. Meanwhile, Poland continues to prepare its citizens for possible Russian aggression. This was reported by The Telegraph. Warsaw is expanding basic military training programs for men and increasing the defense budget to 4.5% of GDP. More and more citizens are undergoing training in shooting clubs and volunteer organizations. There, they learn shooting, guerrilla tactics, and first aid. But that's not all. While Poles are actively preparing to defend their country, border guards discovered a tunnel on the border with Belarus. It started on the Belarusian side and ended about 20 meters from the border on Polish territory. Who dug it is still unknown. But you have to admit, this is a rather alarming sign, especially since we all know perfectly well that Lukashenko and Putin are in cahoots. Don't forget from whose territory Russian troops entered the Kiev region on February 24th, 2022. Meanwhile, the European Union is outraged by the upcoming meeting between Donald Trump and Putin in Budapest. As El País notes, if European leaders do not want to clash with the American leader, some countries will have to grant Russia permission to fly through their airspace or force the Russian dictator to choose a longer route. Write in the comments what you think about all of this. Meanwhile, protests in America continue to gain momentum. More than 7 million people are taking part in mass demonstrations across the country. Tens of thousands of people have gathered in Washington and other cities, protesting against the actions of the Trump administration. The participants of the rallies accuse the president of trying to consolidate power and restrict citizens' rights. Historian Timothy Snyder has called these protests some of the largest in U.S. history. People are taking to the streets because of the deployment of state troops, the deportation of migrants, arrest policies, and the government shutdown. In total, about 2,600 locations have been registered across the country. Police are using force, firing rubber bullets, and deploying gas. A shocking piece of news from Paris. The Louvre has been robbed there. The perpetrators smashed display cases in the Apollo Gallery and stole 9 pieces of jewelry belonging to Napoleon and the Empress. A brooch, a tiara, a necklace, and other ornaments, according to Le Pressien. Interestingly, the largest diamond, the Regent, weighing 140 carats, was left untouched, and the thieves simply discarded the broken Beauharnais crown along the way. According to the publication, the crime took only 7 minutes. The perpetrators used a cherry picker, entered through a construction area and a freight elevator, and after the robbery escaped on a motorcycle. The museum was closed for the entire day. The police are searching for the criminals. It seems the Far East has long ceased to be a part of Russia. While the Kremlin is preoccupied with the war, the region is quietly being divided by China and North Korea. The Chinese economy, North Korean migrants, apparently Putin is fine with all of this. But does this mean the Kremlin will simply give up the Far East? Or does he have no choice? And what should we expect going forward? Could it really be that Russia will lose part of its territory? More on this in the additional following report.
Russia is losing the Far East.
Not officially, but in reality.
Without any exaggeration, the Far East has become the most important factor in strengthening Russia's position in the world, our flagship in the new global economic reality.
While the Kremlin is preoccupied with the war, the region is quietly being divided by its neighbors, China and North Korea.
I would call this, a slow creeping, a gradual creeping takeover, a steady creeping migration. In my opinion, for now, control over the Far East still remains in Moscow's hands, of course, but there are more and more Chinese people there, and they are playing an increasingly significant role in the economy. But as they say, today they play a big role in the economy, and tomorrow they'll play a big role in politics.
More than 1 trillion rubles in investments from China sounds like help, but all of it revolves around trade, not the development of the region.
China genuinely wants to utilize Russian resources on a very inexpensive basis, and consequently, they will undoubtedly have that significant opportunity. And that's precisely why I firmly believe that this growing economic reliance and dependence of these particular regions on China will only continue to substantially increase and grow over time.
Also, the Chinese have long ceased to be guests in Russia.
The Far East is simply not needed, so it should be given to the Chinese. After all, that's exactly what they want to do, of course. The Chinese could simply come in and that's it. No one here would resist them anymore. There would be no one to resist and nothing to resist with.
According to various estimates, up to 2 million people live from Vladivostok to the Urals.
So to speak, settling these territories with Chinese people, and in various forms at that. This includes both actual migrants themselves and mixed marriages from which children are born, right? And accordingly, these regions are becoming more and more closely connected to China.
Now, about North Korea. In the Far East, just in the past year, more than 15,000 North Koreans have officially arrived, and unofficially, up to 50,000. And that's not the limit yet. 153,000 new labor contracts have already been ordered.
Russia doesn't have enough of its own workforce today because so many people have been killed in the war, and accordingly, demographic problems still remain. That's why, yes, there aren't enough local people. And North Korea, in this sense, is an excellent supplier of labor resources because the people are disciplined and accordingly know how to march in step in every sense of the word.
So it turns out that Moscow has handed over the region for temporary use. But why is that?
Does Putin need people whom he thinks are easy to control? It doesn't matter, even if it's not him personally, but through intermediaries. That's why he's confident that these people won't start a revolution, won't protest against Moscow's actions. He thinks these are very convenient people, and it would be great if Russia were populated by just such convenient people. After all, you never know what might happen with your own people.
But everything comes at a price. And the longer the Kremlin turns a blind eye, the more important the question becomes, who really controls the Far East?
In the current geopolitical reality, today, of course, the Russian Federation is essentially a subservient vassal state of the People's Republic of China, which the powerful and influential China primarily utilizes as a strategic tool to exert considerable political and economic pressure on the nations of Europe. And we fully understand that the global confrontation is, of course, not primarily between Russia and NATO, no, but rather it is fundamentally between China and the United States. And in this specific case, also between China and Europe. Today's Russia is very much like a loyal guard dog that diligently obeys its master's every single command and directive.
So what happens next? Is it still possible for the Far East to return to Moscow's real control? Or on the contrary, will the influence of China and North Korea only continue to grow?
The influence of China and North Korea will only increase. And accordingly, China itself will decide whether it needs to formally take all of this under its jurisdiction, or if it's enough to have, let's say, today, complete economic control, and tomorrow that will become complete political control.
It seems that while Putin is focused on seizing other people's territories, he is gradually losing his own. And ironically, these territories are being taken not even by enemies, but by the Kremlin's allies.
And right now, let's see how far the militarization of schools in Russia has gone. At the Belgorod School Formula for Success, children were sent to so-called military courses, which in reality turned into dangerous training sessions resulting in injuries. The students were shown scenes of dismemberment, footage so graphic that some children fainted. Instructors demonstrated dangerous techniques of applying pressure to the body, claiming that this teaches survival skills. One of the students was put in a bulletproof vest and subjected to blows from older students as part of the training. Parents are outraged as no one asked for their consent or warned them about the possible risks. Let us recall that the militarization of Russian schools is becoming systemic. Instead of an educational process, children are faced with training sessions dominated by fear and violence. However, Putin's officials call this the upbringing of patriots. That's all for now. Please like this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel Ukraine Today so you don't miss our next episodes. See you next time.